I brought the truth up out of the stone on the coldest night of the year. And I did it because a woman with a broom asked me a question I could not answer. Her name was Enna. She kept the lower gate of Viharan, the old river gate, the one that hadn't opened in 20 winters, sealed with a bar of black iron, and a stone the size of a plow ox rolled across its foot. Nobody used that gate. Nobody had reason to. It went nowhere anyone needed to go, down a stair cut into the gorge wall to a landing the river had long since risen over. And yet the hold kept a warden on it, as it always had, because Viharan did things the way Viharan had always done them, and I was the warlord who kept it that way. I had passed that gate 10,000 times. I had never once looked at the woman who swept its stair. That is the shame I will carry, and I tell it first so you know what kind of king I was before she asked me her question. Not a cruel man. I want to be clear on that, not to spare myself, but because the truth of it matters. I was not a cruel king. I was a careful one. I kept the walls sound and the granaries counted and the border quiet, and I believed, the way a man believes a thing he has never once had cause to test, that a hold run carefully was a hold run justly. I had never learned the difference. There is a difference, and it near cost a good woman her whole life to teach it to me, and I have spent the years since trying to be worthy of the lesson. But I am ahead of myself. Let me tell it the way it came. It was the night of the long dark, the turning of the year, when the whole hold gathers in the great hall for the nomming of the dead. You must understand what this night is to us in the gorge country, where the winters are long and the cold comes up off the Black River like a living thing. When the year turns, we do not feast first. We remember first. Every warden, every soldier, every soul lost that year is spoken aloud in the great hall so the cold cannot swallow them unremembered, because that is the fear here, older than the hold itself, that the dark of the deep winter will take a name and no one will ever say it again. We read the roll so the dark cannot have it, and I stood at the high seat and read that roll myself, as the warlord must, because a name read by the king is a name the whole hold has kept. The hall was full that night. It is always full for the long dark. Firelight on the long stone walls, the smoke of the year's end candles thick under the rafters, the whole of Viharan packed shoulder to shoulder from the high seat down to the great doors, the soldiers in their greys, the stewards in their darker cloth, the servants and the wardens and the children held up on shoulders to see. I read the roll slowly, as is proper, letting each name settle into the quiet before I gave the next. An old horse master taken by his heart in the spring. 2 soldiers lost when the eastern scree gave way in the thaw. A midwife who had brought half the hold into the world and slipped out of it herself in her sleep, full of years. I read them all, and the hall answered each Viharan remembers, and the sound of it, hundreds of voices low together, is a thing that lives in the chest long after. And when I had finished, and the last name had been read and answered, and the hall was quiet with its grief and its comfort both, a voice came up from the low benches by the door. You did not read, my father. I looked down the length of the hall. It is a long hall. The low benches by the great doors are far from the high seat, at the very edge of the firelight, where the cold from the doors reaches and the least of the hold sit, because the least of the hold always sit nearest the cold. And there, standing among them, was a slight woman in a Gatekeeper's shift, her hands still gray with the ash of the gate stair she tended, her face lifted to mine across all that distance without fear and without heat. Only a question. I did not know her. I want you to understand that, too, I, the warlord of Viharan who prided myself on knowing my hold, did not know the woman standing in my own great hall. I had passed her 10,000 times and never once looked, and now she looked at me, and I did not know her name. Your father, I said. My voice carried the length of the hall, a warlord's voice must. Warden Haveth, of the lower gate. Her voice did not shake, and it carried too, though she did not seem to raise it, it was simply steady enough to reach me. He has been dead 20 winters. His name has never once been read at the long dark. I have asked every year of my life. I am asking the warlord now. The hall had gone very still. You could hear the candles now, the small sounds of the fires. I felt the stillness the way you feel a held breath, and I felt, too, something I had no name for yet, a pull behind my ribs toward this small ash-gray woman who had waited 20 years to say a dead man's name out loud. It was not a thing I had felt before. It steadied me and unbalanced me at once, as though a room I had lived in all my life had a door in it I'd never seen. I remember the strangeness of it more than I can say, that in the middle of my own great hall, on the most solemn night of my year, with the whole of V. Heron watching, some deep and silent part of me had turned toward this one voice like a compass needle, finding the north it had been blind to. I did not understand it. I set it aside, the way a careful king sets aside what he does not understand, and I answered her the way a careful king answers. The roll of the dead is the roll the stewards keep, I said. If a name is not read, it is because it is not written. Then someone unwrote him, she said. And she sat down. Just like that she had asked and been answered and would not shame the hall with more. She folded her ash-gray hands in her lap and looked at the fire, and I stood at the high seat of my own hall with the strange sense that I had just lost an argument I did not know I was having. It was not that she had defied me. She had not. She had asked her question, received her king's answer, and accepted it with a dignity that put the whole hall to shame, and in accepting it somehow, she had left the thing more open than if she had raged. Then someone unwrote him. She said it not as an accusation, but as a simple following through of the logic I myself had handed her. If a name is not written, and yet the man lived and died, then the writing was undone. She had only finished my sentence. The long dark went on. There was the feast after, as there always is grief first, then the warm hall and the year's end bread and the ale, the living turning back toward the living. I sat the feast as the warlord must. I spoke to my captains and my stewards. I raised the year's end cup. And the whole while, down at the far low benches, a slight woman in gray ate her bread quietly and did not look at me again, and I could not stop the pull in my chest from turning toward her like a needle. I should have let it go. A king hears 100 small grievances a season, and most are grief looking for somewhere to land. A warden dead 20 years, a name gone off a roll, an old error, a clerk's slip, the kind of thing that silts up in any hold that has stood as long as mine. I told myself all of that as the feast wore down and the hall emptied and the fires burned to coals. But I did not sleep. Someone unwrote him. The word sat in me like a stone swallowed, because I knew the more I turned it over in the dark of my chamber, the more surely I knew that a name is not lost by accident from the long dark roll. I had read that roll 20 years running. I knew how it was kept. It is copied fresh each year from the year before, warden to warden, hand to hand, the most careful writing any steward does, checked and checked again, because to lose a name off the roll of the dead is the gravest failing a keeper of V. Heron can commit. A name does not fall off it. A name is taken off it, once, deliberately, by someone who does not want it read, and then, every year after, the taking is copied forward as though it were the truth, honest hands copying an honest-looking roll, none of them knowing that 20 years back a single name had been quietly left out, and the gap smoothed over so no one would see the seam. 20 winters, 20 copyings, and a daughter at the low bench asking every year and every year not answered, because every year the roll she was measured against was the false roll, and the false roll did not have her father in it. And so every year the honest steward who checked it found no error and told her, kindly enough I am sure, that her father's name was simply not there to read. They were not lying to her, those stewards down the years. That was the terrible cleverness of it. They believed the roll. The roll had been made to be believed. I rose before the dark had thinned. I did not summon my captains or my stewards. I did not want them. Some part of me, the same silent part that had turned toward her voice, did not yet know whom I could want. I took a cloak and a torch, and I went down alone to the lower gate, down through the sleeping hold, down the long cold stair to the forgotten stone at the bottom of V. Heron, where a river no boats came up any more ran black under the last of the night. She was there, Of course she was there. It was hers to keep. Even in the gray before dawn, on the morning after the long dark when the whole hold slept off its grief and its ale, she was there, sweeping the landing above the sealed door. The black iron bar furred with 20 years of frost, the plow-ox stone at its foot, the great slab of the gate behind that had not moved in 2 decades. And she, in her gray shift, sweeping the ash and the frost grit off the stone that no one but her ever walked, because it was hers to keep and she kept it. She stopped when she saw who came down the stair. She set the broom against the wall and stood straight, not afraid. I have faced men across a shield wall who were more afraid of me than this woman was, sweeping the coldest, lowest, most forgotten stone in my hold at the gray edge of morning. "You've come to tell me the roll is the roll," she said. "I've come to ask you what you know about your father." Something moved in her face then, surprise, quickly folded away, the surprise of someone who has stopped expecting to be asked anything at all. She studied me a moment, as though weighing whether the warlord who had never once looked at her was worth the answering. Then she seemed to decide, and she gave it to me plain. "I know he kept this gate," she said. "I know he was warden here when I was small and that he was proud of it, though there was nothing proud about it even then, a dead gate, a river no boats came up anymore, the lowest post in the hold. But he was proud of it the way a man is proud of a thing done right, however small. He kept his stair swept. He kept his tallies true. He used to tell me that a hold is only as sound as its least gate, because a hold that lets its least gate rot has already decided some parts of it don't matter, and a hold that decides that will decide it about people next." She said it simply, an old lesson worn smooth with handling. He believed that. It cost him. How did it cost him? One winter, the winter he died, he grew troubled. I was young, but I remember it. He grew quiet and he stopped sleeping and he would go down to the door at night, to this door. She nodded at the great sealed slab. He would stand there with a candle and run his hand along the seam of it, along the frame where the stone meets the stone, over and over night after night. I asked him once what he was doing and he said he was listening. I did not understand it. I was a child. I thought he meant listening to the river. Her voice did not break, but it slowed, the way a voice slows on ground it has walked too many times. And then one morning he was gone, and they told me he had fallen from the stair into the gorge in the dark, as an old warden might. They gave me his broom and his keys and his gray shift, and they let me stay because someone must keep the gate and I was small and had nowhere else, and a child who sweeps a stair costs a hold nothing. She lifted her chin. "And they took his name off the roll, whoever they are, that is what I know." "Why would they take his name off the roll?" "That," she said, "is the question I have been asking for 20 winters. I thought perhaps the warlord might finally ask it too." I looked at the sealed door behind her, the black iron bar, the stone, 20 years of frost, and the pull behind my ribs was back, stronger now, standing this close to her in the cold, not a wanting of the crude kind, nothing I would shame either of us to name, but a recognition, deep and certain, the way you know your own name when it is called across a crowd. I had lived my whole life believing I had no fated mate. Most men find theirs young, or not at all, and I had gone into my 30th year and passed it with the bond never once stirring, and I had made my peace with it as a king makes peace with a hard fact, a cold seat, a cold bed, a line that would pass to a brother's son, a life given wholly to the hold because there was nothing else to give it to. I had stopped looking before I was 30. I had told myself I was spared a distraction. And here she stood on the lowest stone of my hold with a broom against the wall, and everything in me had gone quiet and sure in a way it never had in 20 winters of ruling, and I understood, not with my mind yet, but with that older silent part of me, that I had not been spared anything. I had only never come down the stair. I did not say any of this to her. It was not the time, and I was not yet a man who knew how to say such things. But I made a decision there, in the gray cold, with her father's daughter looking at me steady and unafraid. I decided to listen the way her father had listened. "Your father ran his hand along the seam of the door," I said slowly, "at night, as though he were listening to it. As though he were looking for something, she said, "Yes." I crossed to the door. She stepped back to let me, and I put my own hand to the seam where the great slab met the frame, where the frost had grown thickest, and I did what her father had done. I ran it along the cold iron and colder stone, listening with my palm the way you listen to a horse's flank for the breath under the hide, the way a builder listens to a wall for the hollow in it. It is a thing you learn if you keep a fortress long enough. Stone speaks to a hand that has learned its language. Load-bearing stone, true stone, stone that has held its place 1,000 years, has a certain deep and even cold, a solidity you feel more than here. This was not that. I ran my hand the length of the seam twice before I let myself believe it, because a careful king does not want to believe the wall of his own hold has been lying to him for 20 years. But there was no mistaking it. The cold came off this slab differently, not the deep, even, patient cold of the gorge rock, but a sharper, emptier cold, the cold of air trapped in a space that should not be there. Under my palm the great stone was hollow. Behind it was not the solid rock of the gorge wall, nor the river landing the hold had always said lay beyond the dead gate. Behind it was a room. "There is a room behind this gate," I said. "Not a river landing, a room, a hollow cut into the rock and this slab set over it to close it." Anna came to stand beside me. She put her small ash-gray hand to the seam where mine had been, laid her palm flat as her father must have laid his, and I watched her face as she felt it, the emptiness behind the stone, the cold that was the wrong cold. "He knew," she whispered. "That's what he found. That's what he was listening to. All those nights with his candle, he'd heard the hollow and he was trying to understand it. There's a room behind the door his own gate was named for, and no one ever told him it was there, and when he found it," she stopped. She did not need to finish. We both knew where the sentence went. "Help me move the stone," I said. It should have taken 6 men and an ox and a day's work with levers and rope. It took the 2 of us until the sun was high, and I will not pretend it was my strength that did it, though I have strength enough. It was hers as much as mine. This slight woman in her gray shift threw her whole weight against the plowox stone beside her king, and when I found the seam of the black iron bar and worked it, she braced the slab so it would not shift back. And when the bar at last came free of its rusted brackets and I set my shoulder to the great stone, she set hers beside mine, and we heaved together and slipped on the frost-slick landing and heaved again. There was something in the working together I had no name for. I had commanded armies. I had never in my life simply worked beside another soul at a hard thing, shoulder to shoulder, breath to breath, both of us grunting and straining at the same cold weight, and there was a rightness in it, older and truer than anything I had done from the high seat in 20 years of careful ruling. My whole reign I had commanded. Here I labored beside her, and it felt more like being a king than the high seat ever had. The plowox stone ground aside. The black bar lifted, stiff with rust, shrieking in its brackets, and the great slab of the dead gate swung inward on hinges that screamed like the year turning, and we stood together at the mouth of a dark that had not been breathed in 2 decades. Cold came out of it. Old cold, the trapped cold I'd felt through the stone, breathing out into the gorge morning. I took a torch from the bracket on the stair. I had brought fire down with me, some instinct having told me I would need it, and I went in first, because I am the warlord and that is what first is for. It was a strong room, a vault cut into the living rock behind the dead gate, exactly where no one would ever have cause to look, for who cuts a treasury behind a river gate no boats come to? And that, I understood even as I stepped into it, was precisely the cunning of the place. It was not hidden despite being a gate. It was hidden because it was a gate anyone could see, that everyone ignored, with a warden set on it whose whole purpose was to make the ignoring look like watchfulness. The best hiding place is not a locked door. It is a door so plainly pointless that no one wonders what is behind it. And it was not empty. The frost had kept everything. That is the mercy and the horror of the deep cold it keeps. By the torchlight I saw them. The great river ledgers of V. Heron Hold, the true ones, the tallies of grain and iron and coin, stacked and sealed and stored in the dark, 20 winters of them and more. The account of the hold's whole wealth, its comings and goings, season upon season, and stored here, walled away, where the hold itself could not see its own books. And beside them, in their own stacks, the thing they had been hidden to hide. A second set of ledgers. A false set. I am no clerk, but I have signed enough of my hold's accounts to know the hand of them, and I did not need to be a clerk to see it once I held the two side by side in the torchlight. The true books showed what had truly been taken in and paid out of V. Heron across those years. And what they showed, when I read them by the guttering flame with Anna at my shoulder, made the cold in that vault the least of the cold I felt. The granaries had not merely run thin in the hard seasons. They had been emptied, skimmed, load by load, wagon by wagon, the true tallies showing grain that left V. Heron and never came back and was never accounted to any famine or any trade. The iron tribute from the gorge mines, the tribute I had believed dwindling with the poor veins, had not dwindled. It had been diverted, ingot by ingot, into names that were not the hold's. And the coin, winter upon winter of the hold's coin, siphoned off into a handful of accounts I did not recognize, private accounts, the private wealth of men who had let their warlord believe, all those years, that V. Heron was simply growing poor. The false books, the ones the hold had actually run on, showed none of it. They showed a hold fallen on hard seasons, lean granaries because the harvests were lean, thin tribute because the veins were thinning, a careful warlord tightening his belt through hard years, counting his diminished stores, never knowing the stores were diminished by theft and not by fate. Someone had robbed V. Heron for years, robbed me, robbed the whole hold, the soldiers on thin rations and the servants on thin bread and the children who went a little hungry through the long winters. And then, to bury the robbery, had walled the true accounting up behind a dead gate, had set a warden to keep it. And when that warden ran his honest hand along the seam one troubled winter and heard the hollow behind it. He found this, Anna said behind me. Her voice was very quiet and it was not a question. She was reading over my arm and she was a warden's daughter and she understood tallies. I saw her eyes moving down the true columns and the false, seeing what I saw. My father found this. This is what he was listening for, and when he understood what the hollow was and what was in it. Yes, I said, they did. Because he had not fallen from the stair. I knew it now the way you know a thing in your gut before your mind has assembled the proof. A man who keeps a dead gate does not, after 40 years of keeping it, simply lose his footing in the dark. But a man who finds the crime that damns the powerful, who is honest enough that they cannot be sure he will stay silent, that man falls, and is mourned briefly, and his gate is given to his small daughter who is too young and too poor to ask the right questions, because a keeper turned out to starve makes noise, and a keeper kept on out of seeming kindness makes none. They had thought it through. They had let her stay. They had put her father's broom in her hand and set her to sweep the very stair that hid the very truth he had died for, and they had counted on the years to do the rest, on a child growing up in that gray shift, never learning to read a tally, never coming down into the vault, never being anything but the sweeper of a pointless gate. They had made only one mistake. They had not counted on the daughter being her father's daughter. They had not counted on her keeping her tallies true and her stair swept, and every single long dark for 20 winters, standing up at the low bench to ask that his name be read. And they had taken his name off the roll. That was the thing that turned my cold rage colder still, standing in that vault. It was not enough to kill him. They had unwritten him. Year upon year, when the whole hold spoke, its lost aloud into the dark so the dark could not have them. The one man who had died for V. Heron's truth had been left out, deliberately, so that the dark would have him, so that even the memory of him would silt over and be gone. They had tried to feed an honest man to the winter twice, once in the gorge, and once every year after in the silence where his name should have been. I stood in that cold vault with the torch in my fist, and I felt a rage rise in me colder and cleaner than any I had known, not the hot rage of a battle, not the roar a king lets loose to move men, but something quiet and absolute, the rage of a man who has just understood that everything he was proud of was built on a lie he was too careful to see. I had kept the walls sound. I had counted the granaries. I had believed a hold run carefully was a hold run justly. And all the while, beneath my careful counting, the hold had been bleeding into private coffers, and a good man's murder had been filed under fell from the stair, and his daughter had swept his grave for 20 years. But there was one thing more. At the back of the vault, set into the living rock, was the warden's seal stone. You will know what that is if you know the old holds. Every gate of Viharan has one, the sinking mark, the graven sigil each gate warden presses with his own hand to close out the tallies of his post, so that the accounts of a gate are sealed by the blood that keeps it. It is old magic, warden magic, the kind the gorge holds were raised on. A seal stone knows the hand of its true line. Pressed by the blood it was made for, it wakes and glows, and the seal is true. Pressed by any other hand it stays dark and dead, and the seal is false, and every warden knows it. The lower gate had one, of course, even the least gate has its seal, and here it was, set in the rock at the back of the very vault it had been made to guard, and it had gone dark. 20 years dark. The deep, lightless dark of a seal stone whose bloodline has been broken, whose true hand is gone, that no living warden can wake. The men who buried this room had left it there. I think they believed it dead and harmless, a cold stone in a cold vault, the seal of a murdered line, and who was left to wake it. The warden was dead in the gorge. His only child was a sweeper who could not read a tally, or so they thought. A dark seal stone is just a stone. They left it and walled it up and never thought of it again. And I stepped past me toward it. I don't know what drew her. Grief, perhaps, the sight of her father's own seal, the mark he had pressed 1,000 times to close his honest tallies. Or blood, the deep tidal pull of a bloodline toward the thing made for it. Or the same sure silent thing that had drawn me, across a crowded hall on the coldest night of the year, toward one steady voice at the low bench. She crossed the vault, and she stood before the darkened seal stone that had been dead for 20 winters, and she reached out and laid her small ash-gray hand flat against it, the way her father must have laid his, 10,000 times, closing out the tallies of the least gate of Viharan. And it woke. Light came up under her palm. Not torchlight, not fire, the deep, slow gold of a seal stone answering the blood it was made for. The gold that has no source you can point to because its source is the bond between the stone and the line. It spread from beneath her hand along every graven line of the warden's sigil, filling the old channels of the mark, running out from her palm through the whole face of the stone, until the graven sinking mark blazed, and the cold vault swam with warm gold light. She gasped and did not pull her hand away. She could not have, I think. The stone had her, the stone knew her. And the bond struck me in the same breath. I had waited my whole life to feel it and never had, and I had made my peace with never, and now it came. And it did not come as I had half imagined it in my younger years, not as thunder, not as some beast in me rising, nothing so simple or so loud. It struck me as certainty made warm, as a knowing that unrolled through my chest the way the gold unrolled through the stone, spreading out from some deep place behind the ribs, filling channels in me I had not known were there, running warm through the whole cold architecture of a man who had ruled alone for 20 years. And what it knew, what the warmth carried as it spread, was this, that she was mine to protect and had always been, that she had always been in my hold, on my lowest stair, sweeping the truth I was too careful to see. That the reason the bond had never stirred in all my searching years was that I had been looking in the wrong places, in the halls of allied holds, among the daughters my counsel paraded, everywhere but down the stair, while she had been here the whole time, keeping a dead man's gate and a live man's truth, waiting, without even knowing she waited, for a king who finally came down and asked. "It knows me," Inab breathed. The gold lit her face from below, and there was no ash in her now, no gray, no sweeper, only a warden's daughter with her hand on her father's mark and the light of her own blood rising to meet her out of the dark. She turned her face to me, and her eyes were bright with the gold and with tears she had held for 20 years. Warlord, it knows me. It knows my hand. He was my father. This was ours. Of course it knows you, I said, and my voice was not steady, and for the first time in my reign I did not care that it was not steady. You are the true blood of this gate. You always were. They put a broom in your hand and called you a sweeper and set you to keep the very stone that hid what they'd done, and they thought the line was broken because the warden was dead. But the line was never broken. It ran down to you. This stone has been waiting 20 winters in the dark for a true hand to wake it, and it is your hand, Ennahavith's daughter, warden of the lower gate of Viharan, whatever they called you. I looked at her in the gold light, and I let her see what was in my face, the thing no one in the hold had seen in 20 years, the thing I had believed I would go to my grave without ever showing anyone. As have I have been waiting too. Though I did not know for what, until you stood up at the low bench and asked me your question. She looked at me across the gold-lit vault, her hand still on the woken stone, and I saw her understand, saw the understanding move across her face, of what the light between us was, of what had struck us both in that vault of buried truth. The bond is not a thing one person feels alone. It had taken her as it had taken me. I could see it in her, the same warmth spreading, the same certainty. And she did not fall into my arms, and I did not reach for her, though everything in me leaned toward her like the needle toward the north. Because there was a thing that had to be done first, and we both knew it in the same breath, and that we both knew it, that neither of us would let the bond be sealed before her father's name was cleared, was itself a kind of vow, truer than any words we could have said. Then wake the hold, she said, the gold burned steady under her hand, and read my father's name. I carried the true ledgers up out of the dark myself. Both sets, the true and the false, the crime and the cover of it, in my own arms up the long cold stair. I would not send a soldier for them. I would not let them out of my own hands, because I did not yet know whose hands in my hold could be trusted, and I was done, after this morning, with trusting a thing simply because it had always been trusted. I did not wait for a decent hour, or for counsel, or for the careful advice of stewards, some of whom I already suspected would have very careful advice to give. I had the great bell rung, not the day bell that calls the hold to its work. The deep bell, the one that is rung for war and for the death of kings, the one whose sound comes up through the stone into the soles of your feet, that no soul in Viharan can sleep through or mistake. I rang it before the sun was well up, and I heard the hold wake beneath it, the confusion and the fear of it, boots on stone and voices calling, and I stood at the high seat of the great hall with the 2 sets of ledgers on the table before me and waited for them to come. They came, all of them torn from their beds and their morning work, frightened and murmuring, filling the great hall as it had been filled the night before for the long dark, but with none of the long dark solemn peace. This was a hall full of alarm, of what has happened, is it war, is the warlord dead? The soldiers in half their gear, the servants with sleep still on them, the stewards in their dark cloth, coming in at the edges, and I watched them come, and I made myself note, coldly, carefully, the way I had failed to note anything true for 20 years. Which of them looked merely frightened, and which of them looked frightened in the particular way of a man who fears he already knows what the bell is for. But I had not rung the bell before I set the guard. I am a careful king. That at least served me now. Before ever the first note sounded, I had put my most trusted soldiers, the young ones, the ones too young to have been anything 20 years ago, across every door of the great hall with quiet orders. So when the stewards came in and the hall filled and I stood to speak, the doors were already held, and no man who found he needed to leave was going to be able to. I told them everything. I told them of the dead gate in the hollow behind it, how the lower gate of Viharan, that we had all passed and all ignored our whole lives, had a room walled up behind it that was not on any plan of the hold. I told them of moving the stone that morning, of what the frost had kept, of the 2 sets of ledgers I now laid out on the table before the whole hall, the true accounting and the false. I did not spare them the numbers, because the numbers were the crime. I read out the grain that had left V. Harren and never come back, the iron that had gone not to the poor veins dwindling but to private names. The coin, winter upon winter of the hold's own coin, bled out of the granaries and the mines and the treasury into a handful of accounts, while the whole hold tightened its belt, and its warlord counted his stores, and believed the belt-tightening was fate. And I watched the faces while I read. I had learned that morning to watch. I saw which faces went gray. I saw which of my stewards, 2 of the older ones, and a third who had charge of the tribute tallies, men who had sat at my own council table for years and given me their careful advice on our hard seasons. I saw which of them went the particular gray of a man watching the walls of his life come down. And I saw 2 of them turn, quietly, the way a man turns who means to slip out a side door while the hall's attention is elsewhere, and find my young soldiers standing across it, unmoving, and turn back with their faces gone grayer still. Then I told them of Warden Haveth. I told them of an honest man who kept the least gate of V. Harren, and was proud of it in the way a man is proud of a small thing done right, who taught his daughter that a hold is only as sound as its least gate, because a hold that lets its least gate rot has already decided some parts of it don't matter, and will decide it about people next. I told them how he had grown troubled one winter, how he had gone down to his gate at night with a candle and run his hand along the seam, listening, though he did not yet have the word for it, to the hollow behind the stone, to the crime walled up behind his own honest gate. I told them what he found. And I told them what it cost him, that he had not fallen from the stair, whatever the hold had been told for 20 years, but had been made to fall by men who could not be sure an honest warden would stay silent, and who had then given his gate to his small daughter and let her keep it out of a seeming kindness that was in truth the cruelest cunning, so that the sweeper of the stair would be the one soul in V. Harren with no power to ask what lay beneath it. The hall was very quiet now. The alarm had gone out of it, and something graver had come in. They were beginning to understand what kind of morning this was. And they took his name off the roll of the dead, I said. That is the last thing I will tell you, and it is the worst. It was not enough to kill him. They unwrote him. They took his name off the long, dark roll. 20 winters ago, and every year since, honest hands have copied the false roll forward, none of them knowing that a name had been quietly cut from it, so that every long dark, when the whole of V. Harren speaks its dead aloud into the dark so the dark cannot have them, the one man who died for this holds truth has been left to the dark on purpose, fed to the winter twice, once in the gorge, and once every year in the silence where his name should have been read. And then I called Enna up from the low bench. She came the length of the hall, all that long distance from the cold benches by the doors to the high seat, in her gray keeper's shift with the ash still on her hands from the stair she had swept that very morning before her king came down and changed her life. She did not hurry, and she did not falter. She walked it the way she did everything, steady and unafraid, and the whole hall turned to watch her come. This sweeper they had none of them ever looked at, walking up to stand beside the warlord of V. Harren. I told them who she was. I told them what the seal stone had shown me, that here, in this gray woman they had passed 10,000 times, ran the true blood of the lower gate, that the line they thought broken had never broken, that when her hand touched her murdered father's darkened seal, 20 winters dead, it had woken to her and blazed with the gold of a bloodline answering its own. I did not tell them that morning of the bond between us, that was ours, and the hall did not yet need it. I told them only what the hall needed, that this was Warden Haveth's daughter, the true warden of V. Harren's lower gate, who had swept the stair of her father's murder for 20 years and asked, each long dark of all those years, only that his name be read. It will be read now, I said. It will be read first before all the dead of V. Harren, this year and every year for as long as this hold stands, and it will be read by me, the warlord, so that the whole hold has kept it, and no hand will ever cut it from the roll again. The hall was silent as the grave they had made of that vault, and into the silence I spoke it, the name that had been unwritten, unspoken, buried under stone and frost in 20 years of a copied lie. I spoke it slowly, and I let it settle into the quiet the way I let each name settle on the long dark, because this was the long dark's true reading, 20 years late. Warden Haveth, of the lower gate, who kept his post, who kept his tallies true, who taught his daughter that a hold is only as sound as its least gate, who ran his honest hand along the seam one winter and found the truth and would not unfind it and died for it, and was wronged in his death by this hold, his fall a lie and his name a silence for 20 winters. He is honored now by his warlord before all his people. V. Heron remembers him. For a moment the hall did not answer. I think it could not. I think the grief and the shame of it held their throats. And then from somewhere in the middle of the hall, a single old voice, an old horse master, I learned later, who had known Haveth in the long ago and had mourned him quietly all these years without ever knowing why his name was never read. A single old voice said it, cracked and low. V. Heron remembers him. And then the hall took it up. Quietly at first, in ones and twos, and then more, and then all of them together, hundreds of voices low and rising. V. Heron remembers him. V. Heron remembers him, the words filling the great hall, filling the very air that had refused them for 20 winters, rolling up into the smoke-dark rafters where the year's-end candles still guttered. And I looked beside me at Ina's face as her father's name filled the room at last, as the whole hold spoke him back out of the dark it had fed him to. I watched her hold it, the thing she had carried so long and so alone, and I watched her finally set it down. She did not weep loudly. She was not a woman for that. But the tears ran down her ash-gray face while the hall said her father's name, and she let them, and she did not once look away from all those faces saying it. The men who had buried it were taken that morning. I will not dress it up as vengeance, and I will not linger on it, because they are not the part of this story that matters. It was justice, plain, cold, the accounting of a hold set right, and the law of the gorge took its course with them as the law takes its course with any who rob a hold and murder its wardens. But I marked even then, and I have marked it every day since, how it was done. Not by the edge of my sword, though I wanted it, standing in that vault. Not by the roar of a king's rage, though I had rage enough to shake the walls. It was done by the reading of an honest name, by the truth brought up out of the stone into the torchlight of the great hall, where it could not be unwritten again, where the whole hold saw it and kept it, and by keeping it made it forever safe. The rest followed the truth the way the flood follows the broken dam, and needed no cruelty from me to make it come. That was Ina's doing, though she never claimed it and would be cross to hear me say it. She had not asked me to punish anyone. In all those 20 winters at the low bench, she had never once asked for a head or a hanging or her father's murderers named and dragged. She had asked one thing only, that his name be read. And I have thought in the years since that this is the deepest lesson she taught me, deeper even than her father's about the least gate, that the truth, simply brought into the light and kept there, does its own justice, and needs no help from a king's cruelty, that a man who reaches first for the sword has usually not yet had the courage to reach for the truth. We were wed at the turning of the next year, at the long dark. Some thought it a grim season for a joining, the night of the dead, the deep cold, the numbing of the lost, and I know there were those who murmured that the warlord might have chosen a brighter festival to take a wife. But we both thought it exactly right, and we did not much care what was murmured. It was on the long dark that she had stood up at the low bench and asked her question, and turned my whole cold reign over. It was the long dark's role that had been made whole again. There was no truer night in all our year to bind our lives. On the very night we read her father's name, first of all the dead of V. Heron, as I had promised, before the soldiers and the wardens and the old kings. And then, with his name still warm in the air of the hall, spoke our vows. And I will say this plainly, because it matters more than anything else I have told you. She did not come to me as a rescued sweeper raised up by a king's favor. I would not have had her that way. And this is the greater thing, she would not have come that way. She came to me as the warden of the lower gate of V. Heron, her father's seal woken and bright again on her hand, the true accounting of the hold kept now by the blood that had always been meant to keep it. I gave her that standing before I ever gave her my hand, because it was hers by right and by blood, and because a bond built on rescue is a bond with a master and a saved thing in it, and that is no bond at all. What is between a fated pair is not master and saved. It is two who stand level and choose. She chose a king who had learned, too late to be proud of and just in time to be grateful for, to come down his own stair and ask a question. I chose a woman who had swept the truth for 20 years and never once let it be taken from her. We stood level, and we chose, and that is the only kind of joining worth the name. I kept the lower gate open after that. I had the black iron bar struck off and carried away, and the plow-ox stone rolled off for good, and I had a new stair cut down to the vault, a clean, broad stair, well lit, with no dark in it. The true ledgers of Viharan are kept there now in the light, where any soul of the hold who wishes may go down and see for themselves exactly how the hold's accounting stands, what comes in and what goes out, so that never again can the books of Viharan be two, a false one for the hold to believe and a true one walled up in the dark. Anna keeps them. She is very good at it, far better than any steward I ever had, because she keeps her tallies the way her father kept his, true to the last measure of grain, and because she knows, as no hired steward could ever know, exactly what it costs a hold to let its accounting go crooked in the dark. The warden of the lower gate audits the books of Viharan now. There is a justice in that I did not plan and could not have improved on. She still carries the old broom most mornings, not because anyone would dare ask it of her. She is the warlord's wife and the warden of the gate and the keeper of the hold's truth. And no soul in Viharan would put a broom in her hand now. She carries it because it was her father's, because it was in her small hand the morning they gave it to her with his keys and his gray shift and their seeming kindness, and she is not a woman who forgets what a thing has cost to hold. She sweeps the new bright stair down to the vault some mornings, the same slow, careful strokes, and I have learned not to offer to have it done for her, because it is not a chore to her. It is a keeping. It is how she keeps her father with her, by keeping his gate the way he kept it, true and swept and proud in the small, honest way, the least gate of the hold minded better than the greatest. I am an old man now, or near enough. I have had long years to think about what kind of king I was before she rose from the low bench and asked me why her father was not read, and I have not spared myself in the thinking. I was not a cruel king, but I was a king who kept order and mistook it for justice, who counted his granaries and believed the counting made him just, who did things the way Viharan had always done them, and passed a sealed gate 10,000 times, and never once looked at the truth walled up behind it, or the woman who swept its stair, because I had decided, without ever knowing I had decided it, that the least gate of my hold did not merit my looking. Her father was right. A hold that decides some parts of it don't matter will decide it about people next. I had. I had decided a whole woman didn't matter, and she was my own fated mate, sweeping the truth beneath my careful feet, and I would have gone to my grave never knowing it if she had been one shade less brave on one long dark night. I am a different king now. I go down my own stairs. I look at my own gates. And when I read the roll of the dead each long dark, I read every name, all of them slowly, and I look at the low benches by the cold doors while I read the benches where the least of the hold sit, because the least of the hold always sit nearest the cold, because I learned, late and hard, that the most important thing in a hold is not always spoken from the high seat. Sometimes it is a question, asked without fear and without heat, by the one person no one thought to hear. She is beside me when I read them, every year. Her hand in mine, her father's seal warm against my palm, woken and bright and answering her blood as it will answer the blood of every warden of that gate who comes after us, down the long years, because the line runs on now, unbroken, into children who will keep the lower gate true. And every year, first of all the dead of Viharan, before the soldiers and the wardens and the old kings, I read the name of an honest man who kept a dead gate and heard the hollow behind it and would not unfind the truth. And I feel my wife's fingers tighten on mine while the whole hall says it back. V. Heron remembers him. And I know that I have done, at last, the one thing my whole cold, careful reign was missing. I came down the stair. I asked the question. I told the truth. And it gave me her.